Picture this: a bustling medieval city, its towering stone walls casting long shadows as the distant thunder of an approaching army echoes across the land. The air is thick with tension, the scent of burning torches mixing with the cold sweat of fear. But here's the thing: these cities weren't just sitting ducks. They were masterpieces of defense, designed with such cunning and creativity that even the most determined invaders often found themselves staring up at impenetrable barriers, baffled and defeated. Today, we're stepping back in time to uncover the secrets behind 25 of the most ingenious defenses that kept medieval cities safe from annihilation. These weren't just walls and gates. They were feats of engineering, psychology, and sheer brilliance that turned entire cities into fortresses capable of withstanding the deadliest sieges. Think about the sheer audacity of it: facing down thousands of enemy soldiers with nothing but stone, wood, and human ingenuity. How did they do it? The answer lies in a mix of innovation and ruthless practicality. Some defenses were so clever they'd make you smile, like hidden traps that appeared harmless until it was too late, or deceptive layouts designed to confuse and corral attackers into killing zones. Others were downright terrifying, like murder holes, openings in ceilings where defenders could rain down arrows, boiling oil, or even rocks on anyone foolish enough to pass beneath. And let's not forget the moats, those iconic water-filled trenches that weren't just for show. They were carefully calculated obstacles, often deeper and deadlier than they appeared. But what makes these defenses truly fascinating isn't just their effectiveness, it's the stories behind them. Each wall, each gate, each hidden trick was born from necessity, forged in the fires of countless battles and sieges. They weren't just built to last, they were built to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast the most relentless enemies. And here's the kicker: many of these ancient strategies still influence modern defenses today, proving that the medieval mind was far ahead of its time. So, if you've ever wondered how cities held their ground against impossible odds, or why some sieges dragged on for years without success, you're about to get answers. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a journey into the minds of the people who refused to surrender, and the incredible structures that made their defiance possible. Let's begin. The moat wasn't just the first obstacle invaders faced, it was a carefully crafted nightmare disguised as a simple trench. While we often picture calm water reflecting castle walls, the reality was far more sinister. Some moats were deliberately filled with rotting waste and sewage, turning what looked like a manageable swim into a disease-ridden death trap. Imagine trying to wade through chest-deep water while dodging hidden wooden spikes, your armor growing heavier by the second as arrows rained down from above. But the real genius lay in how moats played with an attacker's mind. That wide, murky stretch of water wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a psychological weapon. Invaders knew crossing it meant exposing themselves to relentless fire from the walls with no quick retreat. Some castles, like the formidable Caerphilly in Wales, took this further by building multiple concentric moats, forcing armies to endure this gauntlet again and again. Each successful crossing only led to another watery trap, draining morale along with stamina. And here's what many don't realize: moats were rarely standalone defenses. They worked hand in hand with the walls behind them, creating what engineers called the dead zone. By keeping attackers at a distance, moats prevented siege towers from reaching the walls and gave defenders crucial extra seconds to loose another volley of arrows. The water's reflective surface even acted as an early warning system. Disturbances in the moonlight could reveal sneaking enemies long before they reached the gates. The most terrifying moats weren't even filled with water at all. Dry moats, often lined with sharpened stakes called chevaux de frise, forced attackers into narrow pathways where they could be picked off one by one. Others had hidden pits beneath seemingly solid coverings, a cruel surprise for anyone charging forward without caution. These variations show how medieval engineers adapted the concept to their terrain, proving that the humble moat was never just a ditch, but a constantly evolving masterpiece of defensive thinking. Rising like giants from the earth, curtain walls weren't just barriers, they were the ultimate expression of medieval defensive ambition. Picture standing at the base of one, your neck craning upward as the sheer scale of it overwhelms you. These weren't simple stacks of stone, they were meticulously engineered fortifications, often thicker than 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder. Some, like those surrounding Constantinople, reached staggering thicknesses of 25 feet, enough to shrug off the mightiest siege engines of the age. But thickness alone didn't make them formidable. Medieval engineers added subtle slopes to the walls' faces, a genius touch that turned them into projectile-deflecting shields. Boulders hurled by catapults would strike at an angle, their energy dissipating as they harmlessly skidded downward. Even battering rams struggled against these designs, as the sloping surfaces made it nearly impossible to concentrate force in one spot. And here's the clever part: many walls were built with layers. Outer shells of harder stone protected softer, shock-absorbing cores, ensuring that even if attackers breached one layer, they'd face another and another before reaching the interior. The true brilliance of curtain walls, though, lay in how they transformed defense into offense. Walkways along the top, wide enough for carts to resupply archers, became firing platforms where defenders could rain death from above. Towers spaced at precise intervals created overlapping fields of fire, turning the entire wall into a deadly gauntlet. Attackers might dodge arrows from one tower only to walk straight into the aim of the next. Some walls even featured concealed sally ports, small, hidden doors that allowed defenders to launch surprise attacks before retreating back to safety. And then there were the psychological effects. The mere sight of an unbroken curtain wall could crush an invader's spirit before the first arrow was loosed. These weren't just physical obstacles, they were symbols of defiance, towering testaments to a city's refusal to fall. When attackers stared up at those battlements, they weren't just seeing stone, they were facing the collective will of everyone behind it. That's why the greatest sieges in history often turned into wars of attrition, because breaching a curtain wall wasn't just about breaking through rock, it was about breaking the unbreakable. Battlements transformed castle walls into deadly chessboards where defenders held all the strategic advantages. Those iconic alternating teeth of stone crenellations and merlons weren't just decorative, they were a meticulously calculated system of life and death. Picture an archer ducking behind the solid merlon, completely shielded from enemy fire, then stepping forward into the crenel's gap to loose an arrow before vanishing again. This rhythmic dance turned defense into an art form, with each movement synchronized to maximize safety and lethality. And the genius part, the spacing between merlons was never random. Engineers positioned them precisely so that multiple archers could fire simultaneously without obstructing each other, creating relentless, overlapping barrages that overwhelmed attackers. But the real innovation came with wooden hoardings, temporary wooden structures jutting out from the battlements like deadly balconies. These weren't just extra cover, they were game changers. With holes in their floors, defenders could drop rocks or boiling liquids directly onto enemies scaling the walls below, a tactic as brutal as it was effective. Some hoardings even had hinged sections that could be lifted like trapdoors, allowing defenders to surprise invaders with sudden, devastating attacks. The psychological impact was just as powerful. Imagine climbing a siege ladder, only to look up and see a dark wooden structure looming overhead, knowing death could rain down at any moment. What's truly remarkable is how these designs stood the test of time. From the Crusader castles of the Middle East to the towering fortresses of Europe, the basic principles of battlements remained unchanged for centuries. Even when gunpowder rendered some aspects obsolete, the core idea, fighting from protected elevation, endured. Modern military bunkers and sniper positions owe a debt to these medieval innovations, proving that sometimes the simplest solutions are the hardest to improve upon. Yet battlements were just one layer of the castle's deadly anatomy. Hidden within those same walls lurked even more sinister surprises, traps designed to turn every step an invader took into a potential nightmare. Murder holes were the medieval equivalent of a nightmare you never saw coming until it was too late. Tucked away in the ceilings of gatehouses and passageways, these unassuming openings transformed tight spaces into death traps where attackers had nowhere to run. The name alone sends chills down the spine, derived from the old French word murder, meaning ambush, and for good reason. Imagine charging through a dimly lit tunnel, your armor clanking, only to hear a sudden creak above you. Before you could react, a cascade of rocks, scalding oil, or even quicklime, a corrosive powder that burned skin and blinded eyes, would come crashing down. There was no dodging, no shielding, just the grim reality of a defense designed for maximum carnage with minimal effort. But what made murder holes truly terrifying wasn't just their brutality, it was their unpredictability. Defenders could wait until the perfect moment, letting attackers funnel into the kill zone before springing the trap. Some gatehouses featured multiple layers of murder holes, ensuring that even if invaders survived the first volley, they'd face another. And here's the twist: these openings weren't always visible from below. Architects angled them or added subtle covers, making it impossible for attackers to anticipate where death might strike next. The psychological toll was just as devastating as the physical damage. Knowing that at any second the ceiling could open up turned every step forward into a gamble with fate. The efficiency of murder holes lay in their simplicity. Unlike massive walls or moats, they required no elaborate mechanisms, just gravity and timing. Yet their impact was disproportionate. A single well-placed drop of boiling oil could halt an entire column of soldiers, creating a bottleneck of panic. Some castles, like the infamous Château in France, took this further by designing spiral staircases with murder holes along the ascent. Invaders would be forced to climb single file, their right hands the sword-bearing side pressed against the inner wall, leaving them defenseless as projectiles rained from above. Now step back and consider the gates themselves, the very heart of a city's vulnerability. If murder holes were the hidden daggers, the gates were the armored fists, designed to look imposing while concealing layers of deception. From the outside, they might appear as towering wooden barriers, but behind that facade lay a labyrinth of traps, deadfalls, and killing corridors. The gate wasn't just a door, it was a carefully staged theater of war, where every hinge and bolt played a part in the city's survival. The gatehouse wasn't just an entrance, it was a brutal gauntlet designed to turn invaders into easy prey. Picture this: you're leading an assault, finally breaching the outer gate, only to find yourself trapped in a narrow stone corridor. Before you can celebrate, an iron portcullis slams down behind you, cutting off retreat, while another drops ahead, sealing you inside. Now you're standing in a dimly lit killing zone, pressed shoulder to shoulder with your comrades as archers rain arrows from murder holes above. This was the grim reality of medieval gatehouse warfare, where every architectural detail served a deadly purpose. Some gatehouses took deception to another level with bent entrances, a simple but devastating trick. Instead of a straight path, attackers had to navigate sharp right-angle turns, forcing them to shuffle sideways with their shields useless against flanking fire. The moment they exposed their unarmored sides, crossbow bolts would find their mark. Warwick Castle's gatehouse perfected this with a zigzagging passage, its walls studded with arrow loops that let defenders pick off intruders like fish in a barrel. Even if attackers survived the initial onslaught, they'd spill into an inner courtyard, another trap masquerading as open space. Here, surrounded on all sides by high walls, they'd face a fresh wave of defenders while boiling tar cascaded from the battlements above. But the real stroke of genius, gatehouses were self-contained fortresses. Thick wooden doors layered with iron plating could withstand battering rams for weeks, while murder holes in the ceiling allowed defenders to drop fire or quicklime on anyone below. Some, like the one at Caernarfon Castle, featured multiple portcullises operated by hidden winches, each one a potential death sentence if lowered at the right moment. And let's not forget the psychological warfare. Dark, claustrophobic passages amplified the terror, making even the bravest soldiers second-guess every step. Now imagine adding mobility to this nightmare. Drawbridges didn't just block access, they actively toyed with invaders. One moment, the bridge might appear lowered, a tempting invitation. But as attackers rushed forward, defenders could yank it skyward, sending the front ranks tumbling into a spike-lined moat. Others were designed to collapse under weight, engineered to break only when enough enemies had crowded onto them. The drawbridge was the ultimate bluff, turning a city's weakest point into its most unpredictable weapon. Drawbridges were the ultimate game of psychological warfare, a tantalizing invitation that could vanish in an instant. That heavy wooden platform spanning the moat wasn't just a bridge. It was a carefully balanced instrument of control, rigged with counterweights that allowed defenders to yank it upward with terrifying speed. Picture the scene, an attacking army surging forward, only to watch helplessly as their path to victory suddenly tilted skyward, leaving the front ranks scrambling to avoid tumbling into the water, or worse, onto hidden spikes below. Some drawbridges took deception even further. At Bodiam Castle, engineers installed a hidden release mechanism that could collapse the bridge remotely, turning what seemed like solid footing into a deadly trap. The moment enough attackers crowded onto the platform, a single defender could trigger the mechanism, sending them plummeting into a pit lined with sharpened stakes. It was a brutal lesson in patience. Rush the gate too eagerly, and you'd pay the price. But the real genius lay in how drawbridges forced invaders to play by the defenders' rules. Unlike static gates, which attackers could slowly batter down, a raised drawbridge created an impassable gap. No battering ram could reach it, no siege tower could cross it. And here's the twist. Some castles built fake drawbridges, fixed structures designed to lure attackers into wasting time and energy trying to breach them, only to discover they led nowhere. Now imagine the terror of crossing one even when it was lowered. Every step forward meant committing to a path with no retreat. Defenders often waited until the bridge was packed with enemies before raising it, slicing the attacking force in half and leaving those who'd crossed stranded between walls and moat. It was a masterclass in controlling the battlefield, proving that sometimes the most powerful defenses weren't about brute strength, but about manipulating an enemy's every move. Beneath these deceptive surfaces lay another layer of secrets, tunnels snaking through the earth like hidden arteries. While invaders fixated on what was above ground, defenders could move unseen, emerging behind enemy lines or vanishing just as quickly. These weren't just escape routes, they were ambush corridors, turning the very earth beneath attackers' feet into a weapon. Beneath the chaos of siege warfare raged another battle, one fought in suffocating darkness where the air was thick with dust and the constant fear of collapse. Countermining turned the earth itself into a battlefield, where defenders and attackers clashed in tunnels barely wide enough for a single man to crawl through. Imagine the horror of digging through damp soil, your only light a flickering torch, when suddenly the wall before you crumbles and you're face to face with an enemy miner, his pickaxe already swinging. These underground clashes were brutal, intimate affairs, fought with knives, shovels, and even fire, as combatants burned oxygen reserves along with their opponents. The siege of St. Andrew's Castle in 1546 became legendary for its subterranean warfare. Scottish defenders, hearing the telltale scrape of English sappers digging toward their walls, began their own tunnel, not to escape but to intercept. When the two tunnels collided, the resulting fight was less a battle than a slaughter in a pitch-black corridor. But the real terror came when the Scots rigged their countermine with barrels of gunpowder, collapsing the entire passage on the invaders. The ground itself became a weapon, swallowing men whole in an instant. Some countermines weren't just traps, they were psychological weapons. Defenders would dig networks of false tunnels, leaving behind eerie echoes or strategically placed debris to confuse enemy miners. At the fortress of Candia, Venetian engineers created listening tunnels, narrow shafts where guards could press their ears to the ground, detecting the faintest vibrations of approaching diggers. Once located, the invaders' tunnels were flooded with smoke or boiling water, turning their own strategy against them. What made these underground wars so critical was their unpredictability. While armies clashed above, victory might hinge on a single miner's strike below. A well-placed countermine could collapse an entire siege tower's foundation or undermine a section of wall, rendering months of surface attacks pointless. It was warfare stripped to its rawest form, no banners, no battle cries, just the desperate scrabble of men fighting for every inch of darkness. Now, shift your gaze upward from the depths where men fought like moles to the towering stone giants that loomed over every medieval skyline. These weren't just lookout points, they were the beating hearts of a city's defense, engineered to dominate both the battlefield and the minds of those who dared to attack. Round towers didn't just dot the skyline, they revolutionized medieval warfare. While square towers had vulnerable corners that crumbled under bombardment, round towers presented a smooth, curving surface that sent cannonballs skidding harmlessly aside. The physics were simple but brilliant. A glancing blow transferred far less energy than a direct hit, leaving these stone sentinels standing long after other defenses had fallen. The White Tower in London became the gold standard, its massive cylindrical design proving nearly impervious to siege engines. But the real mastery lay in the details, like those deceptively simple spiral staircases. Winding clockwise, they forced right-handed attackers to swing their swords against the central pillar, their movements cramped and awkward, while defenders descending had full freedom to strike. These towers weren't just passive shelters, they were bristling with offensive potential. Arrow slits narrow on the outside, flaring inward, gave archers wide firing angles while offering almost no target to return fire. Some towers, like those at Crac des Chevaliers, featured concealed chambers where reserves could wait until the perfect moment to surge forth and repel invaders. And their placement was no accident. Positioned at intervals along curtain walls, they created overlapping fields of fire, ensuring no attacker could approach without being exposed to arrows, boiling oil, or rocks from multiple directions. What truly set round towers apart, though, was their role as final strongholds. When outer walls fell, defenders could retreat inward, sealing themselves inside these circular fortresses. Thick doors barred by crossbeams turned them into temporary citadels, buying precious time for reinforcements or negotiation. Some even had their own wells and food stores, allowing garrisons to hold out for weeks. The message was clear: breaching the walls didn't mean victory. There was always another layer, another challenge, another circle of hell for invaders to face. Beyond these towering sentinels lay an even broader network of deterrents, outer defenses designed to break an army's will long before it reached the walls. From hidden ditches to strategically placed outposts, medieval engineers turned every inch of terrain into part of the kill zone. The castle wasn't just a building, it was the heart of a sprawling, lethal ecosystem. Barbicans weren't just gatekeepers, they were meticulously designed slaughterhouses disguised as outer walls. Picture an invading army surging toward what they thought was the main gate, only to find themselves herded into a narrow stone funnel, their numbers useless as the passage forced them shoulder to shoulder. The Barbican at Crac des Chevaliers took this cruelty to another level with its infamous hairpin turn, a 180-degree twist that slowed attackers to a crawl while defenders peppered them with arrows from hidden slits above. This wasn't just defense, it was psychological torture, turning every inch of progress into a blood-soaked ordeal. Some Barbicans featured killing alleys, where the walls seemed to close in as attackers advanced. These corridors, barely wide enough for 3 men abreast, had murder holes lining both sides and overhead, creating a 3-dimensional kill zone. At Alnwick Castle, invaders who made it through the outer gate would find themselves trapped in a courtyard-sized barbican, a wide open space that was anything but safe. The moment they stepped inside, archers on all 3 sides would unleash volleys, turning the area into a shooting gallery with no cover. The genius lay in the illusion of opportunity. The farther attackers pushed in, the more hopeless their situation became. But the real terror of Barbicans was their unpredictability. Some had collapsing walkways or hidden pits beneath seemingly stable ground. Others, like the one at Caerphilly Castle, featured staggered gates that forced attackers to zigzag under constant fire, their shields rendered useless by the angles of attack. And here's the twist: Barbicans weren't just passive traps. Defenders could launch surprise sallies from concealed side doors, striking at the flanks of besiegers before retreating back into the labyrinth. It was a brutal game of cat and mouse where the walls themselves seemed alive with malice. Now imagine adding fire to this nightmare. Some Barbicans hid pots of Greek fire, a sticky, unquenchable inferno ready to be tipped onto anyone below. The combination of confined spaces and flames made these structures as much about terror as tactical advantage. An army might brave arrows or boiling oil, but the sight of their comrades burning alive in a stone throat was often enough to shatter morale. The Barbican didn't just defend the gate, it weaponized the very act of approaching it. Greek fire wasn't just a weapon, it was a nightmare made liquid. A Byzantine innovation so devastating its exact formula was guarded like a state secret. Imagine standing on the deck of an enemy ship as a stream of sticky, roaring flame arced through the air, clinging to wood, sails, and skin, burning even as men plunged into the sea in desperation. The terror wasn't just in the flames themselves, but in their defiance of nature. Water couldn't quench it. Some accounts even claim it burned fiercer when doused. The Byzantines deployed it through pressurized tubes mounted on their ships, creating a weapon so psychologically overpowering that entire fleets would scatter at the mere sight of its telltale glow. The defense of Constantinople in 674 showcased its brutal efficiency. As the Arab navy closed in, Byzantine ships unleashed gouts of fire that turned the sea itself into a blazing inferno. Survivors described sails vanishing in seconds, men leaping overboard only to find the flames followed them into the waves. What made Greek fire truly unbeatable wasn't just its lethality, it was the mystery surrounding it. The recipe, possibly involving pine resin, sulfur, or even crude petroleum, was known only to a handful of artisans and the imperial family, disclosing it was treason punishable by death. This secrecy meant enemies could never replicate it or devise reliable countermeasures, leaving them helpless against its horror for centuries. Yet the most ingenious defenses didn't always rely on human invention. Medieval cities often turned to nature itself, weaving the landscape into their protective schemes. Thick forests were left uncut to slow advancing armies, forcing them into narrow, ambush-prone paths. Swamps were expanded to swallow siege engines whole, their muddy grasp stalling entire campaigns. Even rivers were weaponized. Dams could be broken to flood approach routes, while others were diverted to create instant moats. At Carcassonne, engineers tapped into natural cliffs, integrating them seamlessly into the walls so that the earth itself became an unbreakable barrier. These weren't just passive obstacles, they were active collaborators in a city's survival. A forest might hide archers, its tangled underbrush masking deadly pitfalls. A swollen river could isolate attackers, cutting supply lines while defenders waited comfortably behind their walls. Nature didn't just shield these cities, it fought alongside them, turning every hill, every thicket, every stretch of unstable ground into a silent guardian. And when combined with human ingenuity, these natural defenses created fortresses that weren't just strong, but utterly inseparable from the land they stood on. Mont Saint-Michel didn't just rise from the sea, it weaponized the tides themselves. Perched on a rocky island off Normandy's coast, the Abbey fortress became untouchable twice a day as surging waters transformed the surrounding flats into a swirling moat no army could cross. Attackers who hesitated found their siege equipment swallowed by quicks, and like mud, their supplies stranded on distant shores. This wasn't just geography, it was a timekeeping trap, forcing enemies to race against nature's clock. The Benedictine monks who designed its defenses didn't fight the sea, they enlisted it as their most loyal soldier. But tidal isolation was just one way medieval cities bent nature to their will. Consider Carcassonne. Its double walls fused seamlessly with sheer cliffs that left invaders staring up at an impregnable stone curtain. Or the Venetian lagoon, where shallow, shifting channels confounded would-be conquerors' ships that strayed from marked routes ran aground, becoming stationary targets for artillery. Even swamps, seemingly useless, became strategic gold mines. The Polish stronghold of Malbork Castle sprawled across marshland, its foundations stabilized by oak pilings while invaders' siege towers sank helplessly into the muck. The brilliance of these natural defenses lay in their permanence. Unlike man-made walls that could crumble under bombardment, a mountain couldn't be toppled, a tide couldn't be drained. And they came with built-in psychological warfare. There's nothing quite as demoralizing as watching your entire advance halted by terrain your enemy didn't even have to build. Some cities took this further by enhancing nature's gifts. At Dinant, defenders carved staircases into cliff faces that could be collapsed mid-ascent, sending attackers tumbling. Others, like Edinburgh Castle, relied on volcanic plugs, sheer rock formations so steep that scaling them required more luck than skill. Now, shift from the raw power of nature to something far more subtle: deception. Because sometimes the best defense wasn't just making a city hard to attack, it was making invaders question whether they were attacking the right place at all. Some medieval defenders didn't just build walls, they built illusions. The Castle of the Moors in Portugal mastered this dark art, with sections of its ramparts carefully designed to look weak and crumbling. To an invading army, these seemingly vulnerable spots appeared like golden opportunities, gaps in the defenses where they could concentrate their assault. But the moment attackers rushed forward, they'd find themselves funneled into killing zones, surrounded on three sides by hidden archers. The weakness was a carefully staged performance, and the price of falling for it was death. This wasn't just about trickery, it was about controlling the battlefield. By dictating where enemies would attack, defenders could prepare every inch of the killing ground in advance. At Château-Gaillard, Richard the Lionheart ordered sections of the outer wall built thinner, knowing French forces would target them. What the attackers didn't realize was that the inner wall behind it was twice as thick, and the courtyard between them was a perfectly measured shooting gallery. The French broke through the first barrier, only to find themselves trapped in a stone vise, their triumph turning to slaughter. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the tactical advantage. An army that believed it had found a flaw in the defenses would commit everything to exploiting it, only to realize too late that they'd played right into their enemy's hands. Morale would crumble faster than any wall. Some castles took this further by staging fake retreats, luring attackers deeper into the complex before springing the trap. The message was clear: in medieval warfare, nothing was as it seemed, and overconfidence could be deadlier than any arrow. Nowhere was this deception more refined than in the use of dummy fortifications. Entire false gates were constructed, complete with convincing drawbridge mechanisms that led straight into dead ends. At Crac des Chevaliers, invaders who breached what they thought was a secondary entrance found themselves in a narrow courtyard with no exits, just high walls lined with archers. These weren't mistakes, they were masterclasses in misdirection, turning the invaders' own aggression against them. And here's the brilliance of it all: these strategies didn't just protect the castle, they preyed on the attackers' minds. Every decision became a gamble. Was that crumbling wall a genuine weak spot or another death trap? Could they trust their eyes when even the landscape seemed to conspire against them? By the time an army realized they'd been outthought, it was often too late. The real fortress wasn't just made of stone, it was built from doubt, hesitation, and the creeping fear that every step forward might be their last. Fear wasn't just a byproduct of medieval warfare, it was a precision tool, sharpened and deployed with chilling calculation. Picture the gates of a besieged city, not just barred with wood and iron, but adorned with the rotting heads of previous attackers mounted on pikes. This wasn't mere savagery, it was a targeted message seared into the minds of those who approached. This is what awaits you. The Mongols elevated psychological terror to an art form, hurling plague-ridden corpses over walls with catapults. The stench alone could paralyze a city, but the real weapon was the invisible horror spreading through the streets, a biological attack centuries before germ theory existed. But sometimes the most effective terror required no violence at all. The deafening boom of war drums echoing across a battlefield wasn't just noise, it was a primal assault on the nerves. At the Siege of Orleans, French defenders staged nighttime raids with torchbearers spaced impossibly far apart, creating the illusion of an endless army marching in the dark. Attackers who heard the screams of their comrades being tortured within earshot found their resolve crumbling faster than any wall. Even colors became weapons. The sight of a city's black banners symbolizing no quarter would be given could make seasoned soldiers hesitate. The genius of these tactics lay in their economy. Why waste arrows when dread could do the work for you? At Château de Coucy, defenders rolled massive, flaming barrels down the hillside at night, the fiery spectacle designed to make invaders question whether the earth itself was rebelling against them. Other castles piped eerie sounds through hollow walls, ghostly moans, or the simulated clash of unseen armies, to convince besiegers they faced supernatural forces. Fear didn't just weaken enemies, it turned their own imaginations against them. making every shadow a threat and every silence a prelude to disaster. Now shift from these grand spectacles to the quiet, relentless work happening in the background. Because while fear might break an army's spirit, it was the unsung heroes of siege defense, the engineers, the cooks, the blacksmiths who ensured there would always be another barrel to roll, another arrow to loose, another day of defiance. When the gates were barred and the walls manned, it wasn't just soldiers who decided a city's fate, it was the butcher, the baker, and even the children playing in the streets. Ordinary civilians became extraordinary defenders, turning their homes into fortresses and their everyday tools into weapons. Imagine the scene during the siege of Jerusalem, where women hurled pottery shards from windows and children dropped stones onto besiegers below. This wasn't chaos, it was organized desperation, a testament to what happened when an entire population refused to surrender. Boiling tar wasn't just a soldier's weapon, it was a communal effort. Housewives heated cauldrons over hearth fires, while blacksmiths forged makeshift hooks to tip them onto attackers. Millstones, normally used for grinding grain, became deadly projectiles when rolled off rooftops, crushing siege ladders and the men climbing them. In Toulouse, citizens dismantled their own homes to build barricades, sacrificing their roofs to reinforce crumbling walls. The message was clear: when survival was at stake, everyone had a role to play. But the true power of civilian resistance lay in its unpredictability. Professional armies knew how to fight other soldiers. They weren't prepared for a city where every alley hid an ambush, where a seemingly harmless old man might drop a barrel of burning pitch from a third-story window. During the defense of Vienna, students formed guerrilla bands, using their knowledge of the sewers to launch hit-and-run attacks on Ottoman sappers. These weren't trained warriors, they were booksellers and cobblers fighting with whatever they could grab: a butcher's cleaver, a carpenter's hammer, a kitchen knife. And then there was the endurance factor. While professional armies relied on supply lines, civilians were already home. They knew where the hidden cellars held extra grain, which wells never ran dry. A garrison might starve in weeks, but a determined populace could stretch meager supplies for months, turning starvation into a weapon against the invaders. At the siege of Leningrad centuries later, this same spirit would echo, proof that the will to protect one's home could outlast even the cruelest sieges. Now shift from the fury of the fight to the quiet, relentless arithmetic of survival. Because no matter how brave the defenders, no matter how high the walls, a city couldn't hold out without one critical resource: food. Granaries weren't just storage, they were strategic strongholds, carefully placed and fiercely guarded. A single well-stocked silo could buy a city precious extra weeks, tipping the balance between surrender and salvation. The real test of a siege wasn't just breaking through the gates, it was outlasting the people behind them. Granaries and wells weren't just storage facilities, they were the ticking clocks of siege warfare, counting down to an attacker's defeat. Picture a city like Carcassonne, its stone chambers packed floor to ceiling with grain, dried meats, and barrels of pickled vegetables, enough to feed every soul inside for 18 grueling months. These stockpiles weren't haphazard. They were meticulously calculated, down to the last calorie. Engineers designed granaries with raised floors to keep rodents out and ventilation shafts to prevent mold, while scribes kept ledgers tracking every ounce consumed. A single miscalculation could doom a city, so defenders planned for worst-case scenarios. Harvests failed, supply lines severed, and enemies camped outside the walls for years. But food alone wasn't enough. Without water, even the best-stocked fortress would crumble in weeks. That's why medieval engineers dug wells so deep they tapped into underground rivers, like the one beneath the Rock of Gibraltar, which could quench an entire garrison indefinitely. Some castles, like the Welsh stronghold of Chepstow, built their wells inside fortified towers, ensuring enemies couldn't poison them. Others, like the desert fortress of Masada, constructed vast cisterns to capture rare rainfall, turning every drop into liquid gold. The message to besiegers was clear: you might outnumber us, but you'll never outweight us. Attackers knew this, of course. Starvation was their weapon of choice, and they wielded it ruthlessly. During the siege of Kenilworth, rebel forces held out for nearly a year, until royalists systematically burned every farm within miles, ensuring no food could slip through. But defenders had counterplays. Some, like the Knights Hospitaller at Crac des Chevaliers, disguised secret tunnels as sewers, using them to smuggle supplies past enemy lines. Others salted away emergency caches in hidden cellars, revealing them only when morale hit its lowest. And then there were the unsung heroes of siege survival, the animals. Pigeons became feathered messengers, darting past enemy camps with vital intelligence tied to their legs. Dogs patrolled the walls at night, their growls warning of sappers tunneling below. Even bees were weaponized hives hurled from battlements turned into swirling, stinging chaos. But no creature was more vital than the humble rat-catcher's terrier. A single infestation could devour months of food reserves overnight, making these small, snarling defenders as crucial as any swordsman. Now, shift from the silent war of stockpiles to the living, breathing allies who fought alongside humans not just as tools, but as cunning participants in the battle for survival. War animals turned medieval battlefields into scenes of utter pandemonium, where the line between soldier and beast blurred into one terrifying force. Picture a swarm of bees unleashed from clay pots smashed against stone walls, their furious buzzing drowning out the screams of besiegers scrambling to escape. At the siege of Thessalonica in 904, defenders rained down hives like living artillery, sending entire battalions into panicked retreat. No armor could stop 1,000 stings to the face. But the chaos didn't stop there. Dogs, bred for size and aggression, patrolled the walls at night, their growls giving away enemy sappers tunneling below. Some were even trained to carry burning torches strapped to their backs, charging into siege camps to set tents ablaze. Then there were the bears. During the siege of Vienna, Polish defenders unleashed captive brown bears clad in spiked armor, their sheer mass plowing through enemy ranks like living battering rams. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. Soldiers who'd faced cavalry charges without flinching broke formation at the sight of a half-ton beast roaring toward them. Even pigeons played their part, flitting through enemy lines with coded messages tied to their legs. One particularly clever trick involved starving birds. Defenders would release them to scavenge from besiegers' grain stores, then follow their flight paths to locate and raid supply caches under cover of darkness. The brilliance of war animals lay in their unpredictability. Unlike human soldiers, beasts couldn't be reasoned with or intimidated. A bear didn't care about treaties. A swarm of bees ignored white flags. They turned the natural world into an extension of the city's defenses, forcing invaders to fight on two fronts against both the walls before them and the primal terror creeping up behind. Now shift from living weapons to engineering triumphs that defied gravity itself. Movable bridges weren't just crossings, they were masterclasses in deception, capable of vanishing in an instant to leave invaders stranded. At the fortress of Chinon, engineers designed a bridge that could collapse section by section, its counterweighted planks flipping upward like a deadly puzzle. Attackers charging across would suddenly find themselves plummeting into spikes below, while defenders watched safely from the far side. Other bridges pivoted on central axes, swinging sideways to dump entire squads into moats mid-stride. The most ingenious designs appeared intact until the moment enemies stepped onto them. their weight triggering hidden mechanisms that sent planks tumbling into the abyss. These weren't just barriers, they were psychological traps. An army might spend days constructing siege towers only to watch their prized equipment sink into mud when the bridge they'd relied on disappeared beneath it. Some castles took this further with false bridgeheads, seemingly stable platforms that led nowhere, wasting attackers' time and resources. The true genius lay in how these bridges turned approach routes into calculated risks, where every step forward could be the last. Retractable bridges weren't just barriers, they were disappearing acts designed to leave invaders stranded mid-attack. Picture the scene at Chateau de Cousy, where attackers rushing across what seemed like a solid wooden bridge suddenly found themselves teetering on the edge as the entire structure slid backward into the gatehouse. The ground beneath them literally vanished, turning a moment of triumph into a desperate scramble to avoid plunging into the moat below. This wasn't just engineering, it was psychological theater, forcing besiegers to question whether any step forward was safe. The genius of these bridges lay in their simplicity. Heavy counterweights hidden inside the gatehouse allowed a handful of defenders to yank the bridge inward with terrifying speed, often while attackers were still crowded onto it. Some designs, like those at Harlech Castle, used a pivoting mechanism that could flip the bridge vertically, transforming it into an additional barrier against the gate. The flexibility was devastating. Siege towers that took weeks to build became useless overnight when their approach route disappeared. Even battering rams were rendered impotent, their operators left hammering at thin air where the bridge had been moments before. But the real mastery was in the timing. Defenders often waited until the last possible moment to retract the bridge, luring attackers into overcommitting. At the Siege of Rochester, English forces allowed French knights to begin crossing before swiftly withdrawing the span, leaving heavily armored soldiers to flounder in the water while archers picked them off at leisure. The message was clear: every inch of ground had to be earned, and even then, it could be snatched away in an instant. Now, shift from these vanishing pathways to a deadlier puzzle overlapping fields of fire, where medieval architects turned entire landscapes into precision killing zones. By positioning towers and arrow slits at calculated intervals, defenders ensured that no attacker could advance without stepping into the line of fire from multiple directions. The fortress of Crac des Chevaliers perfected this with its concentric walls, each layer covering the next in a deadly crossfire. An invader dodging arrows from the east would unknowingly walk straight into the aim of archers to the north, their movements herded like cattle into the most vulnerable positions. What made this system so effective was its ruthlessness. There were no safe angles, no blind spots, just a relentless gauntlet where every step forward came at a cost. Even if attackers breached one section, they'd find themselves pinched between fire from behind and fresh volleys ahead. It was defense distilled to its purest form, geometry wielded as a weapon, turning simple lines of sight into an inescapable web of death. Concentric castles didn't just stand against invaders, they swallowed them whole. Picture an army breaching the outer wall, battered but triumphant, only to find themselves staring up at an even taller inner wall, its archers already taking aim. This was the brutal genius of Crac des Chevaliers, where every layer peeled back revealed another nightmare. The outer walls, formidable on their own, were merely the first course of a lethal feast. Attackers who made it past the initial barrier would find themselves trapped in a killing field between the two rings, exposed to crossfire from every direction. The higher inner walls gave defenders an unobstructed view of the carnage below, turning the courtyard into a shooting gallery where every step forward was a step closer to death. The Crusaders perfected this design not just for strength but for psychological devastation. An army might spend weeks and hundreds of lives storming the outer defenses, only to realize their hard-won victory was just the beginning of a fresh hell. Supplies left outside the first wall became unreachable. Siege engines that breached the outer ring were too damaged to assault the next. And here's the twist: concentric castles weren't static. Defenders could abandon outer sections strategically, funneling enemies into ever tighter spaces where their numbers meant nothing. At Margat, another Crusader stronghold, attackers who breached the third wall found themselves in a maze of dead-end passages, their progress halted by murder holes and boiling oil poured from above. But the true mastery of concentric design lay in its adaptability. Each layer could function independently, so even if one fell, the others held. Garrisons in the inner rings could launch counterattacks through hidden sally ports, striking at besiegers from behind while they were still tangled in the outer defenses. It was like fighting a hydra cut off one head and two more took its place. By the time an army reached the innermost keep, they were often too exhausted, too depleted to finish the job. Now shift from the stone-cold logic of architecture to an even more unpredictable force, the skies themselves. Weather didn't just influence battles, it dictated them. A sudden storm could turn a dry moat into an impassable lake, or a bitter winter freeze might solidify muddy ground just enough for siege towers to roll forward. At the Siege of Lisbon in 1147, Crusaders prayed for rain to fill their dwindling water stores, only to curse it days later when their trenches flooded. Nature was the wild card neither side could control, but smart defenders learned to wield it like a weapon. Consider the Mongols, who timed their assaults for winter when frozen rivers became highways for their cavalry. But defenders fought back by flooding fields before the freeze, creating uneven ice that shattered under hoofbeats. Coastal castles like Dover weaponized fog, launching surprise raids when visibility dropped to zero, then vanishing back into the mist. Even wind played its part. Archers atop cracked desk chevaliers waited for gusts to die before loosing volleys, while besiegers prayed for tailwinds to carry their fire arrows farther. The most cunning defenders didn't just endure the elements, they engineered them. At Mont Saint-Michel, monks studied tide tables like battle plans, knowing the sea would drown careless attackers twice a day. Others built cisterns to collect rainwater, turning drought into a siege-breaking weapon when enemies' wells ran dry. Weather wasn't just an obstacle, it was the ultimate mercenary, loyal to whoever understood its rhythms best. And in the hands of a prepared defender, a storm could be deadlier than any arrow. Winter wasn't just a season, it was a silent ally that could turn the tide of battle with a single frost. Picture a Mongol horde charging across what should have been solid ground, only to feel their horses' legs plunging through thin ice into hidden floodwaters below. Russian defenders near Novgorod mastered this cruel trick, deliberately bursting dams to saturate fields before the deep freeze. What looked like flat terrain became a death trap when temperatures dropped. Horses and men alike would crash through the brittle surface, their armor dragging them under while defenders picked them off from dry land. But the real genius came when those same defenders sprayed their own walls with water each night. By morning, the stone would gleam under a thick layer of ice, transforming smooth surfaces into impossible-to-scale slopes that sent climbers tumbling back to the ground. The Teutonic Knights learned this lesson the hard way during their invasion of Russia in 1242. Their siege towers, painstakingly built over weeks, became useless when the ice-coated walls repelled every grappling hook. Meanwhile, Russian archers bundled in layers of fur waited patiently as the knights' exposed skin froze to their metal armor. Nature did the killing for them. Even fire, siege warfare's great equalizer, could backfire in deep cold. At the Siege of Vienna, Ottoman troops watched helplessly as their flaming arrows snuffed out midair, the extreme chill stealing their heat before they could strike. But flooding wasn't just a winter tactic. Dutch defenders turned their entire country into a weapon by opening dikes, drowning Spanish invaders in carefully channeled torrents during the 80 Years' War. The waters rose slowly, just enough to strand cavalry in waist-deep muck while defenders patrolled in shallow draft boats, picking off stranded soldiers at their leisure. These weren't desperate measures, they were calculated acts of environmental warfare. Even castles near rivers engineered drowning meadows, lowlands designed to flood predictably, creating moats that expanded during rainy seasons. Attackers who camped too close might wake to find their supplies floating away, their siege engines mired in mud. Now, shift from these elemental defenses to something even more unshakable, the invisible fortifications woven from faith. Because when stone and steel weren't enough, medieval defenders called upon higher powers to bolster their walls and their resolve. Sacred relics weren't just objects of devotion, they were psychological fortresses, invisible walls built from pure belief. When Constantinople's defenders unfurled the veil of the Virgin along the battlements during the Arab siege of 717, they weren't just displaying a piece of fabric, they were weaponizing hope. To the exhausted soldiers below, that shimmering cloth symbolized something no battering ram could break, the conviction that heaven itself fought alongside them. The effect was electric. Men who moments before had been on the verge of collapse found themselves gripping their swords tighter, standing straighter, as if the relic had physically reinforced their spines. This wasn't blind superstition, it was calculated strategy. Medieval commanders knew faith could stretch supplies farther, make walls feel higher, and turn farmers into fanatics. At the siege of Antioch, crusaders claimed to unearth the Holy Lance, the very spear that had pierced Christ's side. Whether genuine or clever fabrication, the effect was undeniable. Starving, outnumbered troops rallied around the relic like a battle standard, launching a desperate counterattack that shattered the Seljuk siege. The message to attackers was clear: you're not just fighting men anymore, but the will of the divine. Yet relics weren't always passive symbols. Some cities staged elaborate rituals to maximize their psychological impact. Chartres Cathedral claimed possession of the Virgin's tunic, which priests would parade along the ramparts during sieges while chanting psalms. The spectacle wasn't just for defenders. Besiegers watching from afar would see the shimmering procession and question whether their assault invited divine retribution. Even the relics containers played a role. Gilded reliquaries caught the sunlight like beacons, their glow visible for miles, a constant reminder that the city stood under celestial protection. But faith alone couldn't stop arrows. That's where the spies came in, the shadow warriors who turned information into armor, while relics fortified hearts, scouts and informants sharpened minds. Venetian agents in Constantinople famously infiltrated the Fourth Crusade's camps, their reports allowing defenders to anticipate every assault. Other cities employed listening posts, outlying farms where loyal peasants monitored enemy movements, sending coded messages via laundry hung on clotheslines or the arrangement of hay bales. The best spies weren't shadowy figures in cloaks, but millers, shepherds, and merchants whose ordinary lives masked their lethal observations. The most brilliant defenses blended both strategies. When cracked des Chevaliers faced Saladin's forces, its knights combined sacred banners with a network of Bedouin scouts who tracked the enemy's every move. Faith gave defenders courage, while intelligence gave them precision, a combination that could unravel even the mightiest siege, because the strongest walls weren't just made of stone, but of knowing where the enemy would strike and believing you could stop them. Scouts and signal fires turned miles of wilderness into an extension of the city's defenses, a living, breathing early warning system that could spot danger long before it reached the gates. Picture a lone rider galloping through the night, his horse's hooves kicking up dirt as he raced to deliver the one advantage no wall could provide: time. But human messengers were just the beginning. High on remote hilltops, sentries kept watch over iron braziers filled with slow-burning peat and sulfur, ready to ignite a chain of beacon fires that could relay an invasion alert faster than any horse. The Great Wall of China perfected this system with its towering signal towers, where columns of smoke by day and flames by night could carry coded messages across hundreds of miles in mere hours. A single puff might mean scouts spotted cavalry. 3 rapid bursts could signal a full-scale assault. Carrier pigeons, those feathered couriers, played an equally vital role. During the siege of Samarra in the 9th century, Abbasid defenders released pigeons with tiny scrolls tied to their legs' pleas for help that slipped through enemy lines unnoticed. The birds' unerring homing instincts made them ideal for covert communication, their flight paths immune to ambushes or blocked roads. Some cities bred specialized war pigeons, selecting birds that could fly higher and faster than their wild counterparts. The Venetians even maintained a network of pigeon lofts across their empire, creating an aerial postal service that outran any ship or soldier. But the most ingenious signals required no technology at all. In the Scottish Highlands, defenders used sunlight flashing off polished shields to send Morse code-like messages between mountaintops. Welsh archers stationed in watchtowers would blow horns in specific sequences, 3 short blasts for infantry, 2 long for cavalry, allowing entire regions to mobilize before the enemy even crested the horizon. Information didn't just supplement medieval defenses, it was the defense, transforming empty landscapes into vast sensor grids where every shepherd's hut and hunting trail became part of the intelligence network. Now shift from these watchful eyes to the hidden veins running beneath the city, the clandestine escape routes that turned even the direst sieges into games of cat and mouse. Because sometimes the best defense wasn't standing your ground, it was vanishing into the earth itself. Secret tunnels weren't just escape routes, they were lifelines woven beneath the earth, invisible threads of survival when all seemed lost. Take Masada, where Jewish rebels carved a hidden staircase into the cliffside, a path so discreet that Roman besiegers camped below never spotted it. When the fortress finally fell, the tunnels allowed a handful of survivors to slip away under cover of darkness, carrying their story into history. But these passages weren't just for retreat. At the siege of Château-Gaillard, French defenders used a sewer tunnel to launch a midnight raid, emerging like ghosts behind English lines to torch siege engines before vanishing back underground. The psychological impact was devastating. Nothing unnerved an army like the realization that solid ground beneath their feet might open up at any moment. Some tunnels served darker purposes. Beneath cracked des Chevaliers, a labyrinth of chambers stored enough grain to outlast years of siege, while others led to secret springs, ensuring defenders never thirsted. But the most ingenious were the sally tunnels, narrow passages that erupted behind enemy camps like wasp nests. At the siege of Candia, Ottoman troops woke to find Venetian soldiers pouring from what they'd assumed were rabbit holes, their own trenches turned against them. These weren't just holes in the dirt, they were geopolitical chess moves, shifting the balance of power without a single battering ram. Yet even the mightiest tunnels paled next to another weapon: diplomacy. When steel and stone failed, words could fracture an enemy coalition or buy precious time. The defenders of Constantinople famously played rival factions against each other, dangling trade concessions to Genoese merchants in exchange for naval support. At Vienna, bribes sent to Ottoman allies delayed reinforcements just long enough for Polish cavalry to arrive. Diplomacy turned neighbors into shields, transforming distant kings into unwitting defenders through treaties sealed with gold rather than blood. The shrewdest cities mastered the art of the feigned negotiation. During the siege of Tyre, defenders strung Alexander the Great along with false surrender talks while secretly reinforcing weak points in their walls. Others, like Malta's knights, exploited cultural pride, daring the Ottomans to attack during Ramadan, knowing hunger and heat would sap their strength. A well-timed letter could be as lethal as a volley of arrows, especially when it carried whispers of rebellion in the enemy's homeland. The lesson was clear: survival wasn't just about repelling invaders, but outthinking them long before they reached the gates. Now shift from the silent war of words to the thunderous spectacle of siege engines, not as tools of attack, but as instruments of psychological domination. Because sometimes the best defense was making sure your enemy never dared to strike at all. A lone city could be starved into submission, but a network of cities. That was an entirely different beast. The Hanseatic League didn't just trade wool and timber, it traded protection, weaving a web of mutual defense across northern Europe that made even the boldest warlords think twice. When Lübeck's gates shuddered under attack in 1367, its call for help wasn't met with silence. It summoned a fleet of allied ships from Bremen, Hamburg, and Rostock, their sails blotting out the horizon like a storm. The would-be conquerors suddenly found themselves outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and staring at the sobering truth. Attacking one city meant declaring war on 90 others. These alliances turned geography into a living shield. The Lombard League's defiance of Emperor Frederick Barbarossa in the 12th century showed how unity could outmuscle even imperial ambition. Milan, Venice, and Brescia didn't just share soldiers, they shared blacksmiths to forge weapons, masons to repair walls, and spies to infiltrate enemy camps. A besieger might breach Milan's walls, only to find Venetian crossbowmen reinforcing the battlements and Florentine gold funding mercenary strikes against his supply lines. Politics became warfare by other means, where a well-timed marriage alliance or trade embargo could cripple an enemy long before siege engines rolled into view. But the true power of these pacts lay in their unpredictability. The Swiss Confederacy, born from mountain villages banding together against Habsburg dukes, turned their reputation for mutual aid into psychological armor. Attack one canton, and within days hardened pikemen would come pouring down alpine passes from 5 others. By 1476, the mere sight of a Swiss relief column could make seasoned armies abandon sieges mid-assault. Why waste lives storming a city when its allies would arrive before the ladders even touched the walls? Alliances didn't just defend cities, they reshaped the very logic of conquest. When Granada fell to the Spanish in 1492, it wasn't just Isabella's cannons that sealed its fate, it was the collapse of its North African alliances, leaving the last Moorish stronghold isolated like a ship without sails. Conversely, tiny Ragusa modern Dubrovnik survived for centuries between Ottoman and Venetian giants by playing both sides with masterful diplomacy, its walls bolstered more by treaties than timber. The lesson echoed across the ages. In medieval warfare, the strongest walls weren't always made of stone. Sometimes they were built from promises, sealed with handshakes and the unspoken threat that an attack on one would awaken a sleeping swarm. Now shift from these grand coalitions to the quiet revolution happening beneath the clang of swords, the slow, relentless evolution of defenses that turned medieval warfare into a chess match between architects and generals. Because while alliances could summon armies, it was innovation that ensured those armies had something left to defend. Every siege, whether won or lost, left behind something far more valuable than rubble lessons carved in blood and stone. When cannonballs began shattering medieval walls in the 1500s, defenders didn't just rebuild, they reimagined. Angled bastions emerged, their sloping surfaces designed to deflect projectiles like a shield turned sideways. The old rounded towers, once symbols of invincibility, gave way to sharp, geometric star forts with overlapping fields of fire that turned artillery's own power against it. This wasn't just evolution, it was revolution, proof that the best defenses weren't static, but living ideas forged in the crucible of failure. Take the siege of Rhodes in 1522. The Knights Hospitaller, battered by Ottoman cannons, watched their high medieval walls crumble under the new warfare. Yet when they rebuilt on Malta just decades later, their fortifications bristled with low, thick bastions angled like spear points to disperse cannon fire. Even the ditches grew deeper, not to stop men, but to swallow rogue shots and keep debris from piling into makeshift ramps. The message was clear: adaptation wasn't optional. A wall that stood unchanged for centuries was a wall destined to fall. But the true genius of this arms race lay in its democratization. Star forts, with their intricate symmetry and mathematical precision, spread across Europe like blueprints of survival. Dutch engineers like Menno van Coehoorn refined the designs, adding hidden galleries where defenders could fire through camouflaged vents. The old castles, with their romantic turrets and towering keeps, became relics overnight, their verticality a fatal flaw in an age where flat trajectories ruled. Defense had become a science where every angle was calculated, every thickness tested against the latest artillery. Yet for all their innovation, these forts carried the DNA of their medieval ancestors. Those overlapping fields of fire, they echoed the murder holes and arrow slits of cracked des Chevaliers. The star-shaped outlines, spiritual successors to concentric castles where each layer covered the next. Even the humble moat endured, now widened to keep cannons at bay. The tools had changed, but the principles: control, deception, relentless adaptation remained timeless. What's extraordinary isn't just how these systems evolved, but how their legacy endures. Modern military bases still use overlapping sightlines inspired by star forts. The defense-in-depth doctrine, born in medieval concentric walls, now defines cybersecurity, and that relentless drive to adapt. It's the same spirit that turns every breach, every failure, into a blueprint for something stronger. Because the greatest defense wasn't stone or steel, it was the unshakable belief that survival wasn't about standing still, but learning how to stand taller. The echoes of medieval ingenuity didn't fade with the clang of swords or the crack of gunpowder. They evolved, weaving themselves into the very fabric of modern warfare. Take the trenches of World War I, those zigzagging scars across Europe's landscape. At first glance, they seem a world apart from stone battlements, but look closer. The same principles that made moats deadly reappeared in those muddy channels. Just as medieval defenders forced attackers into narrow, exposed pathways, WWI trenches funneled soldiers into kill zones where machine guns could mow them down like wheat before a scythe. Even the concept of concentric defense, those layered walls that made cracked des Chevaliers impregnable, found new life in the elaborate trench systems of the Western Front, where secondary and tertiary lines waited to swallow any breakthrough. The parallels don't end there. Modern military bases still use overlapping fields of fire, a tactic perfected by arrow slits and round towers. Cybersecurity experts now speak of defense in depth, a digital echo of medieval castles that demanded invaders fight through gatehouses, courtyards, and keeps. Even urban riot control borrows from the past, with police barricades mimicking the staggered gates and bent entrances that once baffled medieval armies. The tools have changed, but the psychology remains identical: control the enemy's movement, and you control the battle. What's truly remarkable is how these ancient solutions transcend warfare entirely. Airport security, with its layered checkpoints and choke points, operates on the same principles as a Barbican. Firewalls in computer networks function like digital portcullises, dropping to isolate threats. The medieval obsession with sightlines ensuring defenders could see attackers coming lives on in everything from store surveillance cameras to battlefield drones. These weren't just temporary fixes, they were timeless truths about human conflict, discovered through trial and error over centuries of sieges. The greatest legacy of these defenses isn't in their stone or their blueprints, but in the mindset they represent. Medieval engineers didn't just build walls, they solved problems with ruthless creativity, turning every obstacle, whether terrain, technology, or time, into an advantage. That spirit of adaptation still defines the best defenses today, whether it's a castle weathering a year-long siege or a city repelling a cyber attack. The materials change, the scale shifts, but the core lesson endures. Survival favors those who think deeper, plan farther, and never stop refining their craft. So the next time you pass a construction site or notice the security at a concert, look closer. You might just catch a whisper of the Middle Ages, a moat disguised as a barricade, a murder hole reborn as a surveillance camera. Because the art of defense isn't about the era, it's about outthinking the threat before it reaches your gates, and that's a challenge that never grows old. From towering walls to psychological warfare, medieval cities turned defense into an art form, one that blended stone, strategy, and sheer human ingenuity into something far greater than the sum of its parts. These 25 innovations weren't just barriers, they were testaments to what happens when survival hangs in the balance and creativity becomes the ultimate weapon. Whether it was the chilling efficiency of murder holes or the deceptive brilliance of false weak points, each solution carried the same message: come at us, and you'll pay in ways you never imagined. What's truly remarkable isn't just the diversity of these defenses, but how they complemented one another. A moat wasn't just a trench, it was a stage setter for drawbridges that could vanish mid-assault. Curtain walls didn't just stand tall, they directed attackers into kill zones where every arrow slit and battlement had a role to play. Even nature was conscripted into service, from tides that drowned ambitions to winters that froze them solid. This wasn't haphazard fortification. It was a symphony of destruction, each note carefully composed to unravel an invader's resolve, and perhaps that's the most enduring lesson. These cities didn't just outlast their enemies, they outthought them. Every innovation, from the grandest concentric castle to the humblest spy pigeon, was a reminder that defense isn't about passive resistance. It's about anticipation, adaptation, and sometimes outright deception. The medieval mind understood something we still wrestle with today. The strongest walls are those that live not just in stone, but in the minds of those who dare to challenge them. So, which of these defenses left you in awe? Was it the ruthless geometry of overlapping arrow fire, or the psychological mastery of relics paraded along battlements? Drop your favorites in the comments. We could talk about these engineering marvels for hours. And if you're hungry for more deep dives into history's greatest survival stories, hit that subscribe button. Until next time, keep this in mind. Whether you're facing a siege or a modern challenge, the best defense has always been a mix of brains, bravery, and just a dash of medieval cunning. After all, why fight fair when you can fight